心ちゃん。あのさ、これからも俺、心ちゃんの最高のパートナーでいられるように頑張るからさ。だから、これからもずっとパートナーでいるって約束してくれないかな。
うん、いいよ、約束する。
本当？約束だよ。俺、ずっと心ちゃんのこと守るから。
A few moments later.
Soaring past the night to trace the primal light. Let the clouds heal me of the stains. Gently wipe the sorrow off my life. Let my heart brave and spread the wings. Soaring past the night to trace the primal light.
Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on this episode of Early Access Review, we are taking a look at our 2nd anniversary DPS Castorice as well as her summon Netherwing. Now, I did establish in the previous videos that I feel the HP DPS is pretty much the version 3 equivalent of Super Break, and Castorice is sort of feels very similar to Firefly, except that she is kind of taking away your Harmony Trailblazer as Remembrance Trailblazer, and they can both use Gallagher, and then they just need one 5-star limited support to basically make the team work exceptionally well, right? So in summary, Castorice is gonna be, and I'm not joking, a debuffer, buffer, sustained DPS with destruction and erudition, joint attack targeting, all built into a single unit. On top of, yep, the global passive, right? Her performance in the current endgame content that I've tried has so far been very, very exceptional, which is to be expected, and we will be breaking down her best teams, how to use her, build her, and everything in between, right? So with that out of the way, let's get into today's content. Before I actually jump into the creator kit, I must say that the animation quality on Castorice and the dragon and everything, it has probably been one of, if not the best animations I've seen throughout the entire HSR 2 years, right? And combining this with the 2nd anniversary of the additional number of pools, the rework system, I'll let you guys decide towards the end if you think she's gonna be worried for your account. But then jumping straight into the creator kit, it does appear that she has a pretty overloaded kit with like her own personal skills, the Netherwing skills, the passives, the talents, the team comps. But the playstyle is actually very, very straightforward once you actually get into the core principles, which is you heal HP or you lose HP, you'll gain this new bud, which is going to be the new energy system for Castorice. And then once you reach 100% of your new bud, you can then summon Netherwing. And then once you summon Netherwing, use Netherwing to do damage, and then the process just kind of repeats itself all over again. Castorice herself as a unit, almost roughly 90% of her personal damage output is going to be coming from Netherwing. So whether or not she herself deals damage is not going to be that significant, which you can see from the kit over here. For her basic attack, you'll pretty much never use it, never need to care about it, because her skill as well as her enhanced skill, it is completely skill point neutral, just like My Day. For both of which, in summary, you don't really need to care about the damage multipliers that much, because it essentially goes from 50% to main target and 30% to adjacent for like the normal skill into 80% for all targets. But if you want to compare this from a damage perspective, My Day's enhanced skill as well as the enhanced skill, which is Godslayer and Kingslayer, it is 110 and 280. So Castorice's damage for this particular hit itself is not going to be that significant, whereas the main use of Castorice's skill is to provide charge, right? Is to provide the new bud to summon Netherwing as soon as possible, and even then you also won't really use Castorice's enhanced skill, since almost every single time, at least from what I've been playing so far, you will always use the full blast attack from Netherwing and just immediately let him leave the battlefield, and then you just kind of restun him all over again, unless you are playing out with like specific scenarios against specific enemies, or if you're going to be using Sunday, then you need to hold for a little bit, right? Then jumping into Castorice's ultimate is she essentially uses this to summon the dragon with 100% action value advance on top of providing a 20% all type rest for all enemies, which just increases the damage by a little bit higher, right? I'll be explaining how this new bud energy system works in the talent portion, because that is technically tied to a core mechanic as well as the damage output. But the way the Netherwing works itself, which is going to be the dragon, it will also be explained in the Netherwing portion. You essentially just want to have this dragon as fast as humanly possible, and Netherwing will eventually leave the battlefield immediately the moment you reach 0 HP or after 3 turns, which means that for Netherwing itself, it is not a permanent Mimo sprite like Garment Maker or Mimi, right? And since Netherwing always spawns at the very first action, the action value bar, it will always act before Castorice every single time after you use the ultimate, unless you cast the ultimate during Castorice's turn herself. So you can in fact hold his full blast for some additional enhanced skill or teammate damage and then make use of this 20% res downfield, right? Otherwise, this also does bring the question of whether Sunday is optimal for Castorice, since after every single Netherwing's full blast, which is the final breath attack, you use all of his HP, it will leave the battlefield. And then if Sunday pulls up only Castorice, the value does get a little bit questionable, and we will explore that in the team section, right? With regards to the actual combat, you do need to decide if you were to use all of Netherwing's HP, such that it leaves the field instantly, and then you can generate new butt again, or do you save Netherwing's HP for up to 3 turns, you can see by the bottom indicator in the purple corner over there, and wait for the buffs and debuffs at the expense of not generating any new butt. So from what I've been experiencing so far, during full auto, the AI will almost always use a full blast as long as the enemies are going to be alive for Netherwing to target. But if the enemy enters into phase 2, or if you go from cycle 1 into cycle 2 in the middle of the blast, it will be forced to stop and then you'll continue into the next cycle, right? Keep in mind that during this time, you also do get a 20% res down, so you can try to squeeze in some other units damage or ultimates here, or you can just wait for the dragon to spawn again to maximize their value. So for example, your Trivi's ultimate, your Midas ultimate, the follow-up attacks, they do gain a little bit higher damage during this time the nether field is up, right? And from what I have been experiencing at the end of the day, there was rarely a situation where I wouldn't want to use a full blast due to the multiplier increase, which I'll be explaining a little bit later, and the new butt charges for Castorice is extremely fast. I've been getting 1-turn ultimates almost very consistently, and sometimes even 0-turn ultimates, so there's really not too much to be gained from stalling Netherwing's attack, unless specifically you're going to be using Sunday, which I'll be explaining later, right? Then jumping into the new butt itself. So the way this new butt works is you either gain this from healing or losing HP. That is pretty much it, because you do it at the trace tree, which unlocks the new butt gain from healing, right? So this would also include your boss mechanics, such as your Nigador's half HP spears, your Flame Weaver's corrosion heals, or as well as the Polluck's 1 HP set, right? So for the heals portion, keep in mind that new butt can still be obtained even if the units are at full HP. So there's no wastage or no overview. As long as you heal your team, you can still generate new butt, which also I kind of want to talk about a little bit later in Lightcone, which is the Abundance 4-star Battle Pass Lightcone, the Warm Knights, is technically one of the best healing options because you'll heal your entire team by the percentage of max HP, but I digress. So you cannot, however, stack on any new butt the moment Netherwing is summoned unless you get an E2. And this also includes healing when Netherwing leaves the battlefield from the final blast. So it is pretty much impossible to have 2 Netherwings back to back like a Facial ultimate or like a Yunli ultimate. Generally speaking, 1-turn ultimate with Castorice is 100% attainable. In fact, that is the bare minimum, assuming of course you're going to be running an abundant sustain. But most of the time, I do find myself even hitting the 0-turn ultimates with enough HP is going to be lost or healed, right? So that is going to be that. And then for one more line, which is if Netherwing is on field, the HP lost by all allies, it will be converted to an equal amount for HP for Netherwing, which is basically how Netherwing itself, it helps you sustain your team despite Castorice draining a massive amount before you actually summon Netherwing, because all of the damage, it will be absorbed when Netherwing has this giant 34,000 HP pool, which, you know, at this point in time, you pretty much cannot die unless the Netherwing itself dies first, right? Which so far, I haven't seen it happen unless I intentionally choose to let Netherwing go away, right? And then for the technique, it's very straightforward. You just always open up with this technique and you just enjoy the pretty special animation. And I found myself preferring to all in, you know, if you think about should you be saving, I always like to all in with the very first full blast because you just gain so much charge in the first place, even after, you know, you don't get any buffs or the debuffs that apply to the enemy team, right? So that is going to be that. And then one more thing to note is going to be the Castorice global passive. It works exactly like a Bailu Revive, but you have to heal or shield the unit immediately on the next turn in order to prevent death. So for your sustain teams, it will have a added layer of comfort because you essentially get this free Bailu Revive. And then for the sustainers team, you can have a little bit less resets because you technically have this one more extra turn before they have to go again. But that being said, there are actually quite a few limitations that players need to keep in mind because aside from if your unit has no shields or heals, they will immediately collapse, which already established. If your unit takes another hit before the Moon Cocoon goes again, they will die. So for example, if your unit takes one hit and they die, or like they activate the Moon Cocoon, but they take another immediately, it's gone. If your units survive to their turn, but they have a DOT killing them before they could take action or receive a heal, they also die. And lastly, if your unit dies again after the first Moon Cocoon, it's also gone, right? Because there's only one body revive. So aside from these sustains, the built-in heals such as My Day, Blade, Firefly, and Yunli, or enemy mechanics like Flame Reaver and A-Paw Bus, they can also help you trigger this global passive to revive the enemy unit. So that's gonna be Castorice's kit, but honestly, this is sort of like half, if not less than half the kit, because majority of the damage numbers does in fact come from Netherwing itself, right? So there are a lot of words, but in order to summarize everything, you get your new buff to full, you summon your dragon pretty much always does a full blast, and then you leave. That is pretty much how the rotation works every single time. For the passive skills, so you do have a backup, which is I mentioned just now, in case if any enemies fall when Netherwing is still alive, they won't fall, and the damage will be converted onto Netherwing itself, but you do have a additional 500% damage, so you ideally don't really want to trigger this, because even if your Castorice or your teammates can survive, Netherwing itself will have less HP to do its enhanced blasts, so that will technically affect your damage output, a little bit similar to how My Day loses damage if he drops 2 of HP. So ideally, you don't really want to activate this. And another one is just a very small 10% team-wide damage buff. Then for the active skills, I'm going to be splitting this into the Claw, the Claw Swipe, which is the normal skill, the Breath Attack, which is the enhanced skill, as well as the Ultimate, which is the Wing Attack, right? So for the Claw Attack, you sort of don't really need to care about this unless you're intentionally using this to save some HP and you're waiting for buffs and debuffs. For the enhanced skill, which is the Breath Attack, you pretty much always use this to its fullest capacity, right? You are going to be spammable from 100% HP all the way to 1 HP, and with every single blast, you deal increased damage up to a 24%, 28% to a final 34% damage multiplier. So ideally, you do want to cast at least 3 times, but the more you cast it, the more damage you have to scale out. So usually speaking, 4 casts should be the best because it is going to be 25% of your max HP. And then for the final one, which is going to be the Ultimate, the Wing Attack, you are going to have this absolutely ridiculous animation, but it can only be used when the dragon is at 1 HP for one last final hit, which also constitutes as a bounce attack. So as against single target, it also deals an increased number of damage, right? And when Netherwings finally leave the field, you heal your entire ally for 6% plus 800 of Castorice HP. So that is at the bare minimum like 1,500 or maybe 2,000 HP heal for almost everyone in your mums, at least if you have a 10,000 HP Castorice. So keep in mind that under normal circumstances, right, you use 4 enhanced skills into your ultimate because like I mentioned, it is 25% of your max HP all the way up to 1, but if you have any heals in between this, you can actually increase this frequency by 1 more. So for example, if you have environmental buffs or you have any enemy mechanics, you can in fact help you get this additional 1 final bit of stack, which allows you to do 5 blasts instead of 4 blasts into 1 ultimate. Keep in mind that for your Gallagher as well as your Luofu's passive field healing, it only takes place at the final hit. So you wouldn't receive any healing in between the blast attacks, assuming that you're thinking about Gallagher or Luofu. But if the enemy mechanic has heals, so for example, if you attack the Polux, you actually get some heals, or if you attack the Flame Reaver or any environmental buffs from the Member of Chaos, then you can in fact cast 5 enhanced skill into an ultimate. It is almost pretty much, I wouldn't say almost, pretty much impossible to get 6 skill casts because you need to heal for at least 25% plus 1 more HP for 1 more enhanced skill. So usually your Trace 1, which is I'm going to be explaining later, it should max out around 4 or 5 stacks generally speaking, unless you do in fact get Castorice Eidolons, right? So that's going to be that. Then jumping into the traces, that's pretty much it for the Netherwing. The very first trace, you increase the damage down by 30% up to 6 stacks, but like I mentioned, generally 4 to 5 stacks should be the max, so it's around 120 to 150% damage buff, which also further signifies you are definitely going to be running a HP percentage main stat for your elemental sphere, right? And then for Trace 2, you essentially get this 40% speed buff, which means after you have a 4-piece poet that's going to be an 8% speed debuff, you are going to be leaving Castorice at 125.4 speed, which means that if you were to equip a dance user such as Trippy, you can in fact hit the 134 effective speed in combat itself. So you can also use this to potentially make a 4-piece Eagle hyper carry 200 speed Castorice if you want to try that. But me myself, I haven't really tested the extent of this thing, right? So for this personal speed buff, you need to keep in mind that Sunday players should also tune Sunday himself to be slower than Castorice after this 125.4 speed. So specifically, you want your Sunday to be around 118 to 125 speed, because after you cast Dance, this allows your Sundays to also hit 134 speed in combat, right? So keep that in mind. And then for a Netherwing speed buff, this 100% additional, it is sort of to prevent any excess damage. So if you didn't really manage to kill the enemy, the next turn Netherwing can go again, so they can die, technically faster, so you can summon Netherwing again at a faster pace, right? Your 4-piece poet, it will also always be activated as long as your Castorice does not have more than 7 speed. So your base speed is 95, 8% reduction is going to be a 7.6 speed. So as long as your speed subsets don't exceed 7, you can always run the 4-piece poet. So at this point, there's pretty much also no reason to run speed boots for Castorice, because you need a lot of HP as well as this built-in 40% speed buff, right? So that is going to be there. And the final trait, which is going to be the conversion of your healing into new buff, I already explained it a little bit just now, which is also why abundance is so important for your Castorice team building, right? Preservation units pretty much almost have no place in Castorice team comps, and during this period of time, all heals during Netherwing, it will be directed towards Netherwing so that it can replenish even more HP to deal even more enhanced skills, stacking your multipliers and stacking your damage buff, right? Also, like I mentioned, there's no caps to the heals. As long as your unit can heal, even if your team are full HP, you can still generate the new buff. So that is pretty much it for the entirety of Castorice kit. For the minor tracers, 13.3% crit damage, 18.7% crit rate, and 14.4% quantum, which are all excellent minor tracers. And then for the skill leveling priority, you want to max out both Netherwing's talent as well as passive. Then you max out Castorice, talent, ultimate, followed by the skill, followed by the basic. So at this point, I just want to briefly talk about this overall performance I found with Castorice. I will be posting the endgame results, especially in Memory of Chaos, in the later segment afterwards. But in summary, Castorice's performance right now, it does in fact remind me quite a bit of Firefly, right? She's going to be strong enough to be one of, if not the best teams on release, which is going to be the HP scaling DPS, plus your RMC, plus your Tribi, plus your Gallagher. He is also, like I mentioned just now, extremely free-to-play accessible because of this whole RMC and Gallagher combination, and one very synergistic 5-star support. In Firefly's case, it's going to be Rame. In this case, it's going to be with Tribi. And you also have the potential for Castorice to grow even stronger, because just like how Honey Trailblazer got replaced with Fuke, you are most likely going to be getting a RMC replacement in the form of another future 5-star support, right? So eventually, when the 5-star version for Mimi, for RMC, is going to be released, Castorice would most likely be one of the first units to see the highest number of benefits to the addition. So I do feel that Castorice's value, it will be more or less tied to your team comps and less so for the environment, just like how Sword Rate works, unless we have some very anti-synergistic HP components in the future endgame content, right? For the damage output, keep in mind that roughly 90% from Castorice's damage output will be coming from Netherwing, assuming you're constantly doing your full blast. So your relics that do not support your Mimo sprites, such as your 4-piece quantum, it will be very bad for Castorice. So I highly recommend advising against using Genius 4-piece, right? And then the environment for the next couple of months, we already know that it will definitely make Castorice feel like a goddamn goddess, because she's the anniversary unit, the Red Light environment, so all of the endgame is going to make her feel extremely strong, right? Your Nikador half HP spears with quantum winners, your Flame Reverse free heals with quantum winners, and now with the upcoming Polars, which also has an instant % 1 HP, as well as the free heals and the quantum winners, right? So keep in mind that her performance in Memory of Chaos, or all of the endgame, because of all these enemies and the buffs, she's going to feel very strong. She'll feel maybe even beyond tier 0, but I do expect the real performance for Castorice to start the table off when even more units in, like, for example, version 3, like towards the end of version 3 or even version 4, they're probably going to be changing the favoritism towards the new team comps, right? But this is where the next support teammates will come for Castorice to give her another power up. Just like how towards the end of version 2, we have a feud to make Super Big feel a lot stronger again. So I do think that a very similar thing will be happening for Castorice towards the end of version 3, right? So that's going to be that for the overall performance. And now jumping into the Lightcone itself. So generally speaking, Castorice doesn't really have a very close substitute compared to the Xianzhou Lightcone as of this current moment because of the lack of HP percentage effects. So as such, even using off-class elements, so your Abundance Lightcone, your Preservation, as long as they have a high base HP, which is usually 1270, which is going to be the max, they are going to be quite decent as a replacement if you do not want the Xianzhou Lightcone, right? And since Netherwing is going to be a very fast way for me to test the damage, I've done a quick little comparison. just like for Lightcone, just like for Relics, as you can see from the table as you see over here. Right? So Signature Lightcone, Sweat S5, Victory S5, as well as a 1270 base HP Lightcone such as the Bailu or Fuxuan. You can see the damage over here. So for a Signature Lightcone, it's going to be at a base 100%. Raw stats aside, the 30% defense ignore is honestly a very nice baseline because the value by itself is already quite high, and you can stack this on even further with other defense dons also, right? So this can be seen from this defense or shield icon where Netherwing or like Castorice happens when you take damage, right? So I did test this with 4-piece Quantum for maybe 50% defense ignore, but unfortunately 4-piece Quantum does not work with Netherwing, because the buffs are only going to be applied to Castorice itself, so it's going to be considerably worse, and I would highly advise stacking on 4-piece Quantum, right? The 12% action value advance, it can add up quite substantially, especially given how frequently your Castorice can cast the ultimate, and this effect can be compounded even further, for example, using her E2, right? And if you want to use it with Sundays, the speed tuning, do keep this 12% action value in mind, right? Then for substitutes, between Sweat S5, Victory S5, as well as the base HP Lightcones, the Sweat S5, which is the Battle Pass Lightcone, is going to be the closest at 78.6%, but it does take a while to get this to S5 because it's a Battle Pass Lightcone, right? Then on the Victory in the Bink, it is technically even worse than a high HP 5-star Lightcone like Bailu, and there is a very large overcap on crit rate even if I was using a crit damage body, right? So unless you have very good crit damage subsets and can actually make use of this crit rate, I wouldn't advise doing this, and just save this for your Remembrance Trailblazer, which then brings us to like a high HP off class like your Bailu Lightcone or your Fuxuan Lightcone or like even your Tribi Lightcone, right? It is actually only 2% lower compared to the Battle Pass S5 Lightcone. So I would say this is the best substitute for any free-to-play if you do not want to pull for a Signature Lightcone, right? But at the end of the day, it is still more than 20% damage drop-off, with Victory S5 at an almost 30% damage drop-off compared to the Signature Lightcone, right? That's pretty much going to be that. And jumping into the relics for Castorice, it's honestly very straightforward, and you don't really need to overthink too much unless you want to run the 4-piece Eagle, right? Then for your main stats, it's going to be crit damage over HP percentage, and then for your feet, it's going to be HP, your sphere is going to be HP, your rope is going to be HP, everything is going to be HP percentage stat, and then for subsets, all in for your crit values, followed by more HP percentage. Now, I did test this using a crit damage versus HP body, and I found that crit damage body actually outperformed HP by roughly 8%. But keep in mind that this is without a crit damage buffer, such as Sunday or a 4-piece Sacred activated. So with that in mind, if you get more and more crit damage buff for Castorice, then perhaps HP percentage can come closer, especially since we don't really have any HP buffers aside from Tribi herself, right? Other than that, all your main stats, it should definitely be HP percent because of she has a really high 60% damage buff by herself, as well as a very common 4 to 5 stacks of 120 to 150% damage buff from Netherwing, right? You can have some leeway for a speed subsets for up to 7 speed, like I mentioned, or basically 3 speed subs, as long as it remains lesser than 95 in order to trigger your 4-piece poet, right? And speaking about this 4-piece poet, your 4-piece poet is definitely going to be the best in slot because, like I mentioned, the 4-piece quantum actually does not work with Netherwing, right? So this is going to be a considerably worse at a more than 25% damage drop off. So just don't use this. Stick to 4-piece poet and you're good to go. And then if you do want to use a 4-piece ego, this is very niche, but it technically could work because Castorice has a very fast 1 or even 0 turn ultimate. So if you build in this 25% action value advance from Ego 4-piece, as well as signature Lightcones 12% action value advance, you could see the action value gain outvaluing the raw damage numbers that you would have gotten from running a proper DPS set. So this is kind of reminiscent if you want to run a 4-piece Ego on Tribi, or if you want to run a 4-piece Poe on Tribi. At the end of the day, I personally feel that if my damage is going to be good enough, I'm good enough, and I don't have to stress about it that much, which is why I'm still going to be recommending the 4-piece bone, especially for the majority of the player base, right? Then for the planar ornaments, pretty much just run 2-piece bone, not much expansion needed, and you could run the 2-piece banana or the 2-piece fleetless for some additional stats, but bone is going to be the best in slot, and if you're going to be farming for bone, you're also farming for the giant tree or 2-piece, which will most likely be seen played in your version 3 sustain, so I don't really think there's too much of a discussion over here, right? So with that, we have come to the second last portion, which is going to be Castorice's Eidolons. Now, I will be showing case her Eidolons on the live server for 1 versus 2000 because I'm still making more easier as Castorice content. So main Eidolons in summary are going to be the E2 as well as the E6. So for the Castorice E1, it is going to be the exact same wording as your Aircron trace, which is going to be essentially a final damage increase, right? So it's going to be a 20% or 40% final damage buff. And since your Breath and Wing, they are your big hitters, this will be the very straightforward damage increase. But keep in mind, it will not be a 100% uptime to be like 50% or 80% because it is going to be dependent on the enemy HP, on the Castorice HP, right? So that is going to be that. And then for the Eidolon 2, this is going to be the game-changing Eidolon for Castorice. So what this Eidolon will essentially does is you have 2 more hits of this enhanced skill, which means that Netherwing can always achieve the maximum 6 stacks on the trace with the passive, which allows for an up to 180% damage buff. On top of that, this 2 free guaranteed hits is gonna allow you to have 2 more 34% multiplier hits. So that is gonna be pretty much a 60% multiplier damage increase on top of the maximum guaranteed 180% damage buff. And on top of both of these, it also allows you to have a 100% action value advance for Castorice, which always places Castorice right before she summons Netherwing, right? This is always going to be the case. And on top of all this, there's a 4th effect, which is you gain a 30% new butt after casting your next enhanced skill. So this means that every single time you're going to be casting your enhanced skill or like using Castorice in general with E2, you're only going to be needing to stack a 70% new butt instead of a 100% new butt without fail. So for every 2 ultimates, comparatively speaking, if you're using an E0, a E2 Castorice can then in fact use 3 ultimates. Right? So keep in mind, this is, I would say, a very diabolical Eidolon 2. It has so many effects packed into one, but I do want to mention that the buffs on Castorice, because of this 100% action value advance, it will expire extremely quickly. So even the true damage buffs provided by your Mimi, or even if you're going to be using Sunday with Castorice, it can run out very quickly. So it is quite likely that a better support to the similar concept as Tribi will be introduced for Castorice, which is the buffs are tied to only the support's turn instead of the unit's turn. So keep that in mind. Then jump into the E4, which is, at this point, I've mentioned enough. For all of the version 3 E4 so far, they have kind of a decent value. For this, it's gonna be a little bit more 20% healing, which means a little bit more new butts, a little bit more dragon, and with the E2, more big booms. So that's gonna be there. And then finally for the E6, pretty much the classic E6 DPS res pen. But the main thing is gonna be the ignoring of the defense weakness, just like E6 Aircron, allowing her skill to do the same thing, right? 3 more bounce is basically a 120% HP damage multiplier, which, like I established with my day, as well as any of the HP scaling DPS, a 120% multiplier for HP is a lot more impactful than 100% attack. So this is gonna be resulting in a much bigger damage numbers, especially if you were to see on screen, right? So at this point of the time, I would just say between S1 and E1, I would highly recommend S1 first because you really don't have very good substitutes, followed by the E2, and then you can think about everything else. If you just want to pull for E1 Castorice, I personally don't think it's going to be that worth it unless you want to go for the E2, right? So that is pretty much it for Castorice's Eidolons and Lightcones. Now, for the final segment, which I would say is probably one of the more important segments, the team comps for Castorice. Castorice's core damage, right, like I mentioned, is going to be coming 90% from Netherwing itself. And you get Netherwing by consuming and healing HP for the entire team. So in that sense, the more you heal or the more you lose HP, the faster you can spawn Netherwing, which can also directly increase your damage output. So because of this concept, right, there technically isn't a perfect hyper carry support for Castorice, and Tribi is definitely going to be her best in slot because of the HP mechanic as well as the buff up time being tied to Tribi instead of Castorice. So in that sense, if you're going to be running Tribi as a slot 2, our current slot 3 supports, be it Sunday, be it Remembrance Trailblazer, or be it even Runway, they're going to be having pretty similar performances across the board, with some of the common picks being like the ones I mentioned, or even My Day, right? RMC, Mimi is the only one that managed to get a pretty decent one cycle clears from what I've been seeing so far, and I will be going through all of the slot 2, 3, 4 replacements, which at this current point of time is pretty flexible until more specialized units can come in the future. So the current best in slot team comp for Castorice right now is actually gonna be a free-to-play team. Yep, the free-to-play team of Tribi, RMC, and Gallagher is ironically or unironically her best performing team from what I've tested so far, using full E0S0 team with a E0S1 Castorice. And my findings for this reason are going to be as follows. First of all, ease of usage. So you don't really need to worry about speed tuning or when to use full blast, and the answer is always all in on just spam everything for the dragon and it'll just do the highest amount of damage, right? And with the only manual requirements for this team is timing your Gallagher ultimates, timing your Mimi charge, which is going to be pretty standard, and timing your Tribi ultimate such that you don't really waste the Dance. Unless you really got a signature Lightcone for Tribi, then you don't really need to care about that as well. If you take all these into consideration, with your HP main stat being the main stat for all of these supports, your team is also relatively bulky, so it is unlikely that you run into any sustained issues. And this brings us to the next point, which is the ease of build, right? So Castorice and Tribi, they share the exact same relic set, which is the 4-piece poet and the 2-piece poet. So it is basically farming for them at a very, very efficient pace in terms of your relics and your stamina, right? And your Gallagher is going to be on 4-piece Sacrados, and then for your RMC, you can kind of just run them with whatever, with the highest speed possible. Both of them being on broken kill ideally in order to buff damage for both Castorice as well as the Netherwing, right? If you want to give your RMC a little bit more energy, you can consider running the 2-piece Vonweg, right? Luxaka is not going to do anything for them, right? Not super subset hungry for crit or speed, because for your 4-piece poet, it does give you a 32% crit rate. And for the speed subs, you don't really hit any specific speed thresholds, or rather it's not going to be that important, especially when you're going to be using this team, right? And then finally, why I think this is going to be the best team is going to be the actual damage output itself, right? The actual performance. And the reason why this team is the only team that, you know, managed to get this pretty easy one cycle, at least in my experience, is that your Tribi is pretty self-explanatory. She is a HP buffer with Vial Sight to the own turn and the additional charge and follow-up shared with Netherwing and RMC's targeting. Then for your RMC, which is Mimi, she is such a powerhouse of a unit that even without the full 50% true damage, it is still by far at this point the highest damage amplification on top of this 100% action value advance, which means that your Castorice can spawn Netherwing a little bit of a faster pace, right? And since when Mimi gets healed by RMC, because if you cast a skill for RMC heals Mimi, you can also generate more new buff for Castorice, so that's also counted, which is where the performance at this point, in my opinion, it outshines Sunday himself, because Sunday, he actually cannot generate any heals. He can only bring up your Castorice, but because he doesn't have access to heals, he doesn't have access to any damage for himself, he can't really trigger Gallagher's field, he can't really trigger Tribi's follow-up attacks, and he can't really trigger any sort of a new buff aside from just buffing myself. And also, unfortunately, Sunday's energy does not work with Castorice. So between this, I would say that this is the free-to-play team is somehow the best team, right? So that is going to be there. And then jumping into the replacements, which means first of all, your slot 2, which is if you do not have Tribi, who do you use? I kind of narrow out to 2 different options, which is going to be Ranmei or Sunday. Ranmei is actually a very, very decent damage buffer with res down and damage down. 10 Tobloom Rebloom is technically a negative because you don't really want the enemies to be delayed, because you actually want the enemies to hit your team so you can lose more HP. But the damage numbers alone from this, it can ramp up pretty high, especially if you use this in tandem with Remembrance Trailblazer, right? If you do not have Ranmei, you could still use Sunday with RMC at the side. This is technically, in my performance so far, is the slowest for MOC, but it does have potential as long as you manage your speed tuning to allow for minimal or even no wasted Mimi extra turns, which can be a little bit draining, especially for the casual player base, right? Make sure that your Castorice also goes before Sunday every single time, so you do need to speed tune on Sunday, like I mentioned just now, 118 to 125 speed after Castorice goes for action. The performance can definitely improve the 2 cycle, because if you were to swap it out for Tribi, you can be going to be quite nice, especially since Mimi tends to lead to a faster buff expiry, which is going to be an issue if you run both Mimi and Sunday in the same team, right? But that being said, for Sunday specifically, I'll just tie this entire portion of Sunday. If you want to use Sunday with any team comp for Castorice, the playstyle for Castorice, it completely changes, because you want to hold Netherwing for the first summon, let your Sunday pull up Castorice and Netherwing for a second turn into a full blast. And the main reason for this is, first of all, Castorice will always be before Netherwing, and she will almost certainly heal the dragon after casting this Hunt skill, so you can almost guarantee another full blast with the dragon after you use a Castorice and Hunt skill. But a more important reason why is because, and this is extremely, extremely important, your Sunday skills, talent, and ultimate, all of them does not get applied to Netherwing before you summon Netherwing. So you actually have to summon Netherwing first, and then you let Sunday buff up Castorice with all the buffs, your skill buffs, crit buffs, your damage buff from crit damage from ultimate, in order to let the buffs be applied to Netherwing itself. And because Netherwing will always die after you use a full blast, you have to repeat this process every single time you want Netherwing to obtain the buffs from Sunday. Because like I mentioned, 90% of Castorice damage is going to be coming from Netherwing itself. So it is extremely important that you stack on the Sunday buffs to Netherwing and not just Castorice, right? So very, 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 very important. And then for the speed tuning portion, it is recommended to slow down Sunday to either 118 to 125 speed, because with Castorice 40% speed buff minus the 8% from power, she is going to be a 125.4 speed. So this allows you to basically run a pseudo 134, 133 Castorice Sunday setup, especially if you can run a Duns alongside with 3B. If you do not have Duns 3B, so if you're going to be running Sunday with RMC, then this could be a bit of an issue because your Sunday will no longer hit the 134 speed requirement, right? So keep that into consideration. That is pretty much it for a slot 2 replacement. Then for a slot 3 replacement, which is if you want to remove RMC, I am going to be completely honest, there's almost no reason whatsoever why you would remove RMC, because your slot, especially if your slot 2 is already 3B, because this is pretty much the best in slot setup as of what I've been finding right now. Castorice 3B RMC as well as the abundance sustain, right? So there's almost zero downside to running RMC, with all of the upside being one of not the best performing team comps of Castorice right now. She's a free unit, she's very easy to raise, and she's pretty much very easy to play. Just don't waste the charge and you're good to go, right? If for any reason you want to use your RMC to be used as a Harmony Trailblazer for a super break in the other team, then you do not want to replace this with Ranmei, because if you want to replace RMC with Ranmei, that means you are taking away Ranmei from a super break team. And if you take away Ranmei from a super break team just for a HMC, you technically don't really make too much sense, especially if you want to be running a sustainer super break, right? So the only world that you want to replace RMC in this slot is either going to be Sunday, or for a smaller group of people, My Day. Now between both Sunday and My Day, they both perform at the same at 2 cycles with 3B, with potential for My Day to perform a lot better, because one of the issues with My Day is that they don't share the same weakness, right? The enemies wouldn't share the same weakness with both Castorice and My Day. And in the event that they do, I can foresee this team comp being exceptional, because dual DPS having the same weakness is one of the issues. Something like Topaz and Dr. Rachel last time, where the enemies are not weak to both elements. But if they are, I can foresee My Day being one of, if not the best performing teams with Castorice, especially considering you can also vertically invest in both units at a very, very fast pace. Whereas for RMC, you basically hit the cap right now until you get another version 3 support that will replace RMC in the future, right? So that's gonna be that. And this team is also, if you're thinking about it, auto player, very, very auto battle friendly. You don't have to care about charge whatsoever. You just press one button and it's My Day, right? So you'll just get the job done, right? So that's pretty much it for slot 3 replacements. And then for your slot 4 replacement, which is the abundance slot, if you're gonna be using Gallagher for another team, whatever team it is, because he's just such a universal support, you can pretty much run any abundance sustain with Castorice. So between your, for example, Lingsha, Luocha, Bailu, all that kind of stuff, Luocha's heals are stronger and more consistent, with a free emergency heal that can pretty much always be activated for Netherwing every single time. For any sustain, especially if you're going to be running abundance, the difference is honestly not that big. So I would be looking forward to see how the version 3.3 higher scene comes out, and maybe she's going to be a mana sustain. If she's going to be a best in slot teammate, then most likely she'll be the most synergistic out of all of the slot 4 we have as of this current moment. Then before I move on, one last thing, like I mentioned just now, if you do have this S5 Battle Pass Lightcone, the Warmth Abundance Lightcone, it does provide the highest amount of heals, which results to the highest amount of new butt, because it is going to be a team-wide buff, right? And remember that new butt does not have a healing cap, right? So with that, one last thing before I go, these are the findings that I found for the performances in Memory of Chaos with Castorice, E0S1 Castorice, E0S0 Tribute with Zans, E0S1 Sunday, E0S1 Ranmei, as well as the E0S1 Mitre. Everybody's going to be E0S1, and all of the 4 stars or the 5 star free unit, they're all going to be at E6, right? So that's going to be there. One cycle all the way through 3, you can take a look at yourself. And with that, we have come to the end of the Castorice Early Access review, and I'm nowhere near done being this unit. We're going to be taking a look at how Polux works. We want to take a couple of 0 cycles, so look forward to the future Castorice Early Access content, and let me know what you guys think of her in the comments below, right? So word of the day is going to be Stare. Join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord, join Twitter, all the videos. I'll catch up with you. See you guys next time. Take care.